Okay, hey everyone, welcome to an episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today, another cool update for you guys from the brand Crafter Blue. A little about them. They were established back in 2015 out of Hong Kong, and they're an aftermarket professional grade rubber dive strap maker, and now they even offer full-on wristwatches. Now, in terms of their specialty, of course, it's going to be within the space of dive watches. Some key characteristics and design language when you're looking for something within this genre. Of course, you're going to find water resistance, typically some type of screw-down crown. You're going to want to have something that's tough, legible, with a dive time bezel, and a diver's extension is always nice if on bracelets. This is their latest release, being the Mechanic Ocean Mark II in the black dial colorway. And essentially, as a respected, strap maker within the dive strap space, this is their most recent take on a robust underwater exploration watch. These are currently on sale at the time of recording this for $449 direct, or eventually the prices may be raised to $599. I think at either price point, it's still quite reasonable, but of course at $449, the value proposition is going to be a little bit stronger. These are about 41 millimeters in diameter, and they have really strong specs. You're getting that higher beat Miyota 9015, really exceptional build quality, especially considering the more kind of industrial, almost steampunk-like aesthetic here that really combines kind of the best of Seiko silhouettes and Panerai, which are both such strong visual icons within the space of underwater watches. So with that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, guys, so at 41 millimeters across, this is definitely, I consider it a nice sweet spot in terms of divers. Not oversized, definitely not mid-sized, but right there at about that, pretty customary full-sized range. It's only 13.6 millimeters thick, and that's including the crystal height there. And you can see it does have a bit of a slab side, but I think they did a nice enough job. Let me give it a quick little wipe here. Really compartmentalizing each component, separating the side, of course, visually from the case back, as well as that really nice bezel. I will say in terms of functionality, although I do love the way this watch looks, I think if they would have added a bevel here across this lug that went all the way across, it would have acted as a bit of a relief for this action here for your fingers, so that when you're gripping, you would have just a little bit better real estate, because you can see there's no overhang on the bezel. It's actually slightly recessed versus the case. So what that ends up doing is it just gives you a little less to grip with, especially for something that is so low slung, which I like. And although the teeth are quite grippy, it's just ultimately your purchase upon those grips there that for me anyway could have been better. Now, that's by no means a deal breaker, but something I did notice. So although I do really like this flat profile, it definitely gives it a more industrial look. I do think the addition of a bevel, or if they did size the bezel up slightly, but then if they size that up slightly, then it's going to look a little bit bigger, of course, and then, you're going to have to kind of fight another battle, which is trying to make sure that the visual weight kind of aligns with the physical weight and profile on your wrist. Now, the lug to lug is actually quite long at 51.6 millimeters. I don't think it's like deal breaker level, especially considering it's not like it comes on a bracelet and there's some male end links involved. You guys can see even with these really neat inserts here that you actually get basically an end link kind of gap filler. These still are going to be able to turn down really well on the wrist. So yeah, I'm not too worried about the length. It does have I think a nice enough kind of soft curvature in terms of conforming on the wrist, but I do have a larger wrist, so easier for me to say that than it's going to be for somebody with like a 6-inch wrist. Now, in terms of some other details here, guys, you're going to get this nice double domed box sapphire with an inner air coating, as well as an outer anti-fingerprint coating. So, if you were to touch that there, essentially the idea is it's going to be less smudgy, which, as you guys can see, isn't impervious, but I have to say that's pretty good. I'll give it a quick wipe just in case I wasn't picking it up on camera. It may be, and you guys were, but now you can see back to kind of clean and quite flawless. We'll give it a little dust off here. All right. Now, getting into some more details here, guys. You do have a screw down crown, which you would expect, nicely signed. I will say to access the crown, again, the flat plain nature doesn't give you a whole lot of access. Of course, you have the top and the bottom, because you do get a little bit of height, thankfully. But I will say if these were, had some level of contouring on them, it would give you a little bit more functional grip. Although I think visually, again, this ties into this really cool kind of overbuilt kind of steampunk nature of the watch, which I think looks great. So I'm a little bit torn on, okay, well, this could have been better, but you would have compromised some of the visual design, which I think is kind of the best part about this watch. Is visually it's very, very cool looking and quite handsome, especially for somebody who collects dive watches. Now, the movement inside, although you can't see it underneath this solid screw-in case back, is going to be your automatic Miyota 9015. So you're going to get a 42-hour power reserve. It's going to be at 4 hertz or 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of that beat rate. So relatively nice, smooth sweep there, as you guys can see, up to industry standard. Now, the dial is quite simple, with a matte black setup. There also is kind of a fume white dial, which looks really cool. I was hoping to kind of get that one in. I ended up getting the black dial instead. Again, forgot to mention a big shout out to Crafter Blue for sending this review sample in so that I could share it with you all. Now, the handset is actually quite nice. You're going to get brushed hour and minute hands with a polished seconds hand. You can see the pops of blue that tie in with that bezel insert there, as well as the seconds hand, which look great. This is using BGW9 Swiss Superluminova. You're getting, let's see there, 300 meters of water resistance, or about 1,000 feet or 999 feet. There's of course going to be some conversion things there, and for it to be tested, typically they're testing above so they can dial it back however much they want in terms of the rating. So if you ever get confused on why some brands will use certain numbers, just remember that they're also testing them at 10 to 20, 15, 25% higher ratings, so they can dial them back to a number that's going to look a little bit nicer on the dial regardless. Now, the lug width here is actually 22 millimeters, and I think it does kind of suit the aesthetic. I'm a big fan of 20 millimeter lugs, and I think at 41 millimeters, it probably would have been okay with a 20 millimeter strap, which I think would have probably opened it up to some more compatibility. But 22 is not like some odd 21 millimeter or 19 millimeter lug width. So there's still plenty of options at 22 millimeters there. But, for something like, let's say a pass-through nylon strap, typically you're going to want to use, a 20 millimeter, because they don't taper. 22 millimeters for a fabric strap is going to be a little wide. But I think it's going to suit this visual aesthetic. So you'll probably be okay. Also, one thing to kind of zero in while we're talking about the lug width is, again, that really cool kind of 22, even though you have a boxed lug here where it's going to be straight, which is going to be great for matching up with the ends of straps. A cool thing is that they have these unique gap filling end links. Again, it's a nice little bonus. They didn't have to do that, but it's just a nice little detail there. I mean, some people might see that and think, oh, that's an afterthought. Why didn't they just bring the case down? But again, for more compatibility with different types of straps, I'm sure, especially as a strap manufacturer, when they're having to dial in how thick you can have in terms of the thickness taper, not just the width taper, they understand that there can be various clearance issues. So to have something like this where it opens up to where you could take that out, and then you have all of a sudden you have a lot more room to weave in, let's say, a nylon pass-through strap or a chunkier leather or rubber strap. I think that having that flexibility is really cool. So I dig that. I think visually it doesn't break down the flow too much. I think obviously, especially with the OEM strap, and this is a great OEM strap, like you don't even have to consider changing this out of the box. I mean, this thing is absolutely fantastic. There are no notes to make this a better strap. This is a brand, again, that's their bread and butter, is making really great dive watch straps. Now, the strap itself is made out of FKM rubber. It has a 2 millimeter taper down to this nice fully milled pin buckle there. Again, visually it flows with the contouring there. You have one fixed keeper, one floating keeper there. So very cool. And you can see very nicely milled all the way around and nicely finished. Even the finger here is milled, and it does have a nice contour to where as you're weaving this through, just to take a look at it there, look at that. It's going to keep things nice and flat, and you're not going to get a bunch of, it's just like bunching in that transition because of the angle on there. So very cool. So with that said, let's actually get this on the wrist and see how it wears. Okay guys, as you can see on my 7.5 inch wrist, I think this wears really quite well. And for those of you with a smaller wrist, don't worry. Honestly, as you guys can see, my wrist is pretty round and tall. So it's not like it's just a super wide and flat 7.5 inch wrist, right? Like the distribution of the kind of girthiness of the wrist is going to be also quite vertical. So it's not super wide just from a top angle. So I do have to really pay attention to the way things are going to wear. And of course, if I get my wrist a bit too close to the camera lens, you're going to notice that you're going to get a fair amount of perspective distortion, and it's just going to make the watch visually appear much larger than it is. So what I like to do is keep my wrist nice and low, and then just tighten up the frame here so that you guys can get, still a detailed look, but just add a bit of a truer aspect ratio as to how this may lay on your own wrist. And as you guys can see, very clean. Look at the thin profile there. And they're not using a bunch of tricks. That's a side slab. And the fact that the side slab case for the mid case looks so thin just goes to tell you how physically thin it is. So I know you hear 13.6 millimeters and that doesn't sound super thin, but again, this is a 41 millimeter watch, and it also has a relatively long footprint with that 51.6 millimeter lug to lug. So it actually does spread the weight quite a bit, which does help the watch appear much thinner visually than it probably is with its physical footprint. And you guys can see it's still not overpowering the wrist or anything like that. It's not like there's some dramatic overhang. The strap really tapers and hugs the wrist very well, as you guys can see there. And it's not being like overly led by the lug horns. It just has a nice pivot point there that is able to come straight down on the wrist. So I think that looks really good. 22 millimeters, again, although not my favorite width for a watch that's about 41 millimeters. I think it looks good here. And again, it also goes to giving this that really overbuilt vibe while not making it feel ultra chunky, which I like. I like that it still feels relatively sleek. And just that wide stance on the wrist, it ties together. So I like that. Again, so although the numbers aren't my favorite numbers, the way that it all comes together in terms of proportions, I do like a lot. So, I don't want to oversimplify things. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of folks out there that will kind of just look at the raw numbers and say, well, this is either a watch for me or it's not, based off of certain dimensions. I will say the dimensions, they have to play out in a full 3D space. So keep those things in mind, as you're kind of evaluating a watch on your own wrist, right? And don't just stick to certain numbers and think, oh, well, something's going to be too big for my wrist and overpower it. I mean, hey, look, you can see here it has a really nice dial to bezel proportion. So the bezel itself is a bit wider visually, and the dial itself is a bit smaller. You can see next to that date opening there on that date window on the dial, it's not like there's a ton of empty space. So this has a smaller dial, which hence is going to make it seem like a slightly smaller watch. So, and then of course, ultimately it is relatively large, right? Full size, not large size or extra large or oversized, but you're still going to get a nice amount of visual weight and heft on the wrist. But I'm saying that there is a nice balance, right? With the, the overall proportions that you're going to get with the way that this plays out. And that's where I think Crafter Blue did a really good job dialing in the proportions. Even if the scale isn't to your favorite in terms of ultimate dimensions, the proportions here are quite good. So with that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, go ahead and set up for some loom shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. All right. As you can see, it's the loom you would expect, and actually even some surprising loom there from the bezel insert, having the fully indexed 15-minute markings, which is going to be great when you are wearing this for dive timing. Now, in terms of the low light transition, which is something I always like to work in because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to, with these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. As you guys can see here, you're going to get a great amount of visibility and high contrast legibility, right? The readability is great there. Very, very nice. You get the dual batons there at 12 o'clock, which is going to give you instant orientation, even if the watch isn't on your wrist. So very cool. And you guys can see there, the finishing here, I think, I don't want to understate this. This is a really well put together watch in terms of the execution. The fit and finish is very, very clean. Although the styling, right, and ultimately the aesthetic is quite industrial, I will say there's a certain level of the finishing that is impressive in the metal that might be hard to capture on camera. This definitely has a bit of an elevated feel to it, in the same way that a really nice Seiko, even though it's a simple Seiko or a Panerai, right, a very basic cushion case, can feel elevated in certain aspects. I feel like you're getting a little bit of that bleeding through here on this Crafter Blue, where it's essentially a watch that's under $500. I mean, it's like under $450, right around $450. It doesn't feel like it was manufactured. Like if we were to put an NH movement in here, all of a sudden it doesn't become like this, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. Like it would feel like you're selling this watch short if you were to put in, a lower caliber movement. I feel like if you were to put a Swiss movement in here, that you could have charged more, and the case finishing and the build quality would have made up for it. So hopefully that kind of helps reconcile any ideas. I know we all have kind of different equations we work out when we're thinking about value for money. I mean, ultimately, if you like the design, you're going to be impressed with the build quality at this price point. So, and if you don't like the design, then it doesn't really matter if this watch impresses you or not, because you would probably never buy it. So, something else to keep in mind. But getting into some closing thoughts here, guys. On the wrist, nice full-size diver proportions, a more refined take, of course, on that signature Seiko meets Panerai design language that I think they've done a pretty good job with fostering for the Crafter Blue brand in the past. I think, it could use a few bevels to soften some of the harder edges. It would also add a nice relief while you're actuating the bezel, which actually I totally forgot. I don't think I turned to the bezel and the in-hand proportions. So let's do that real quick. Go back and fix that. So we'll get this here. Oh, that's the buckle kind of scraping against the background there. Let's not do that, but all right, it's a little harder to do this. There we go. Nice tactile clicks here. Great sound, the audible side of it. Of course, with this part being polished, it looks really great in terms of that bevel that goes across the top. But again, you're limiting some of the physical grip space there that you would use to grab this thing and potentially grab it while it's wet. I understand completely that a lot of people will never use a dive bezel, and and that's fine. There's some dive watches I've probably only turned the bezel just to realign it to sit at 12. So I get that, right? So it's that's probably a little bit nitpicky in terms of just like today's diver, because if you were going to be taking this, as a dedicated dive watch, you probably already you'd use it as a backup, right? Like you'd have a dive computer or something like that to really keep you going and keep you safe. So yeah, I think the actuation on the bezel would have been better in terms of if it did have that top bevel, it would have been a little bit easier to grip. Of course, now with the camera zoomed in and, reaching in front of the tripod, it was a little bit more of a cramped space. And of course, I was trying to keep the watch in, so it probably it won't be that awkward in real life when you turn the bezel, but it's just, it's not one of the ones that really scream out to me as like a fidgetable type of bezel action to where it's really satisfying, right? I think it's a good bezel action, and it's probably held back and hampered a little bit by just the ergonomics. So I'll leave it at that. Now, in terms of model variants, definitely check the site links for current options and availability. I did mention that they did have kind of a white dial variation. I think they do have another special option as well, like a limited edition. So check the site links for that. Also, you know, in terms of current pricing and sale, depending on when you watch this video, things could have changed, right? There could be even newer releases that happen at that point. So in terms of comparable models, guys, there's a lot of options out there in this price range, you know, around $500, slightly under, slightly over. You know, with similar movements in terms of, you know, getting a Miyota, you know, 9015 or a 9039 or something like that. So these aren't super uncommon in terms of the specs, but where I think the Mechanic Ocean Mark II stand out are on its focus on utility, you know, with a robust form factor that feels very purposeful and a bit less concerned with daily versatility. Like, this isn't, you know, you're not going to see this and think, oh, this could be like a great everyday piece. Sure, you could. This could be an everyday piece for the right person, but it's not one of those ones where it's like a Rolex Submariner where it's just like it also kind of doubles as a go anywhere, do anything. I think this is a very specific aesthetic that has an overbuilt style that really speaks again to nautical stylings and watch collectors that love kind of water sports and collecting dive watches. So, I think in that space is where it helps get some separation, because there's a lot of kind of everyman, quote unquote, type of divers that can be an everyday watch that just happens to, you know, have a turning bezel and, you know, have additional water resistance, versus this, I feel like, you know, the design is more a result of the functionality and not where they wanted a design that looked a certain way and then they kind of baked in the functionality later on. Like, this was meant to be quite functional and quite purposeful in the way that it looks and feels. Now, for me, guys, bottom line, as utilitarian as this design aesthetic is, this Crafter Blue diver surprisingly impresses in the metal. Like, again, like the fit and finish on here is very, very nice. It's unapologetically a dive watch made for dive watch enthusiasts and collectors. So it's one of those things. Yeah, it's just is what it is. And although it does have some shared DNA with other, you know, legacy brands, I will say it feels very much like its own thing, and it doesn't feel like this kind of cheaper derivative option to something else. Like a lot of, you know, really great watches can be, you know, a cheaper alternative to an Omega Seamaster 300, right? Or of course a Rolex Submariner. Like there's icons that exist for a reason, and they're quite versatile, but to a certain point, the reason why they're quite iconic is because they can teeter into the realm of quite boring. So something like this is definitely not going to, you're going to be nowhere near boring with this piece. So with that said, let me know what you all think down in the comments below. If you like the video, please do like, and if you're already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.